Hey guys, Corey and Jen here with you with Dr. Marketing Tips.
Hey, everybody.
And today, what we're going to cover in the 9-part marketing course is public relations for your practice and how you can really leverage some good PR to attract and retain more patients.
So there are a couple things we need to consider before we get started. And the first is that public relations today is much different from the public relations of yesterday. These days we are 24/7 in terms of when we get and when we expect our media and news stories to break. If you've been around for any length of time, you remember when cable came to the market and CNN first was on air. It was the first time that we had a 24/7 news channel, and it really just changed the way that media worked.
Yeah, definitely. And then you look at today with the advent of Twitter and the fact that anyone with a Twitter account is essentially a reporter and they can break a story anywhere across the world in 120 characters or less.
So what this does is, if you're comfortable working in traditional media and you're trying to pitch a story and they aren't biting, it's positive because you've got these other channels now that you can kind of go around traditional media. So one thing that we're starting to think about when we're talking about public relations is that traditional media just isn't as important as they once were, as long as you have the tools to go around the process. So what we're going to talk about today, in a nutshell, is we're going to talk about the many channels that are available to you when it comes to getting your message out from a public relations standpoint. Then we're going to touch on proactive versus reactive public relations. Hopefully 9 times out of 10, you're going to be focused on the proactive, but we're going to give you some examples of both. We're going to discuss some of the basics, what is a press release, what is a media alert, what is B-roll, things of that nature. And then we're going to talk about the simple steps to take when the media actually calls you. And then finally, we're going to end it with some real basics on some media training that you can take back to your physicians. So when they are getting ready to go on camera, some things that they can be thinking about and you can be thinking about top of mind.
So today there are definitely more choices than just TV and newspapers. So let's talk about some of those channels real quick. Obviously, we've got your local news and your cable channels. We've got print, we've got radio, we've got websites and blogs and social media and all kinds of things. I think on my phone, actually, I have like 4 news apps. I don't know why, but there's just a plethora of sources to get your news and your information from. So let's go ahead and talk about TV first. So on TV, typically a reporter, they have a quick turnaround time and they're looking to be the first to break the story with images. Typically today, they're not actually the first to break the story, but they will, provide the images and video and things like that go with it. And unfortunately, they're usually looking for controversy to get the readers going. If you ever hear some of those promos at the end of the day for the 5 o'clock or 11 o'clock news coming up.
I'll actually jump in there. So I do a lot of media in the local market that I'm in, and after a while, I was just so frustrated with all the controversy and the little 2-minute stories that were running, and they always seemed to be negative. And finally, I sat down with the reporter and got to talking to him, and was just had it explained to me that the way that at least in the market that I'm in, the way that they get promoted to larger markets is based on the quick breaking stories that they get canned and filmed on air, canned, and the ratings that they get related to those stories. So if it bleeds, it leads, and if it's controversial, chances are that reporter is going to get their stories played over and over. So they're always looking for the angle, and television is one of those mediums, one of those channels that I will say that sometimes, especially if you're on the inside, you'll see something or hear something that isn't quite right. They don't always have the time to do the background and the research as a print reporters would be doing.
Yeah, and that's why a lot of the times you'll see that if you're really close to a story, you'll know that they only get about half of the story right, or there's only one side that's really told. And in the healthcare industry, that's why they look for a lot of health scares and they provide health segments. Now, the reason that I have an asterisk there is because those health segments, oftentimes, because the news stations are a business just like anything else, you can actually buy those. So it's pay to play and it helps position you as the expert. It's not traditional PR in the sense, but we just wanted to make note of it there. And then a quick example of how we've had to deal with television in the PR sense is one of our doctors, Tiger Woods, had a spine injury a couple of weeks ago, and the news called. They wanted a doctor to go on camera the next day at 7 a.m. So we had to be ready to go, have him prepped, and have him there. I think they wanted him there at 6 a.m. to tape the story and have it play by the 11 o'clock news. So when they do call, you need to be ready for that. And we got some more examples of that coming up in just a minute.
So the next channel to talk about is one that we're all familiar with, and that would be print. And what we're referring to here would be the daily newspapers or your trade publications, or maybe even one of those community publications that we all have in our neighborhoods. What I like about print is that there's a longer lead up time. Typically, the reporter will call or shoot you an email, ask you a particular question, and they have, especially in the healthcare segments, they usually have a week or so to turn them around. If they're running, a daily beat or a real news cycle, then they may only have a couple of hours. But typically, in somewhat of the fluff that gets put in those healthy lifestyle sections of your newspapers, you have a little bit of a lead up time, which allows you to gather your thoughts and to do your research. And that's one of the beauties that I particularly like of print versus TV. TV has huge exposure if you can get on television for your practice in a positive way. It can also have huge exposure if you get on in a negative way. With print, typically the journalist or the reporter will do a little bit more research on the back end before writing the story. And then there's several steps in their process, at least in traditional print, for the editors to step in and to do the background research as well.
It kind of varies by publication, but we always find that if we ask to see the piece, sometimes we don't get to, but sometimes we do. And then we can also check it for errors and have the doc take a look at it just to make sure that everything is as accurate as possible.
And one thing I will mention also, because it goes right in line with this whole research concept, this applies to print and especially to television. If you can become a source for a reporter, they'll reach out to you every once in a while, and they'll ask you what's new in the industry and what kind of story ideas that you've got for them. And we'll cover that later when we're talking about proactive and reactive. But just keep it in mind when you're paying attention, when you're reading that local newspaper, who's writing those stories and what types of stories is it that they're writing. And offering it on a silver platter always helps when you're being proactive in your public relations. And if you're trying to pitch a story to a local print publication, daily newspaper, you want to give them, let's say you shoot them an email, you want to give them all the background and all the information. You literally are doing everything except writing the story. And then, keep in mind that they need to sell these papers and these trade publications too. And that's why we've got an asterisk next to this one, is because there are opportunities, just like in television, to go in and to either purchase print space or purchase blog space or something like that. And you can use it very similar to if the journalist was writing the story for you. It's just all about building those relationships with the local reporters or the publishers of the local publications and seeing what opportunities that might be there for your practice.
Moving right along, there's radio, and a lot of what applies to print also works for radio as far as building up the relationships and sources and things like that. Typically with talk radio segments, they are also always looking for experts. So if you have a doctor that's very well spoken and is comfortable, giving presentations, things like that, they always make for a good source for radio. And you want them to become the go-to expert for your specialty. So that way, if something does pop up, the radio producer knows who to call, and you want them to obviously pick up the phone and give you a call for that. And again, with the asterisk, there are specialty shows that are out there. Recently, we had a chiropractor on a show talking about whether chiropractic care was all it was cracked up to be. And for that, we had to buy some radio time. But in return, he was able to get featured on, it was a 22-minute long radio show. So, just like television and print, their business, and they're trying to make money too. And next up, let's talk about web and social sites. So the thing to do here is look for specialty websites, and that can be anything from sites that relate to exactly what you're talking about. For instance, we'll take the orthopedic route here just because it's easy and I have an example. Um, And if you are looking for arthritis, let's say, there are literally dozens of specialty websites and blogs and things like that where they write every day about dealing with arthritis, and they're open to new content and new writers. And if you reach out to them, they'll more often than not give you the space. Switching gears a little bit as far as the example is concerned, we recently put together a knee infographic, and what we did was we reached out to an arthritis blog, and we said, hey, we have this really cool graphic. We think that your readers would like it. What do you think? And they were open to putting it on. But again, just like all of these other channels, they are looking to make a couple of bucks. So we were able to get it on there. They actually put it on social sites, and they tweeted it out, and they talked about it, I think 2 or 3 times over the month. But it cost a couple dollars, but the return that we saw was definitely worth it. And so the last little tip here is you want to be where the bloggers or the reporters are looking for stories. And typically today, when you're talking about websites and social, they are on Twitter.
Yeah, I actually just heard a woman talking in a podcast, and she has become kind of a local media celebrity in her market, kind of a go-to when it comes to talking about social media. And she was saying, look, I don't find any personal use for Twitter, but I do find it as an opportunity to get myself in front of all the reporters because they're there fishing for stories, and I'm out there throwing out the bait and they're biting on the bait. And she has developed relationships with the reporters by being on Twitter. All right, so let's talk about proactive versus reactive public relations. And hopefully you are only dealing with, for the most part, the proactive. And if you're dealing with the reactive, let's hope it's the positive stuff. Okay, so the proactive. This means that you're being prepared and you're going out by yourself and you're getting the news. Your story is actually in the news. You're looking for opportunities and identifying trends and things of that nature. And when you see a trend popping up, you think about a way that would translate to your practice, and you go out there and you make it happen.
Yeah, an important part of proactive public relations is the outreach perspective. Where the paper, the website, the news station, and you've got a pretty good contact list there. We're going to talk about that in a little bit, but just wanted to make note that it's important that you are looking for those opportunities, and when they arise, you know exactly who to contact.
Absolutely, really good point, Corey. And then we'll give you some examples of proactive public relations that we've been successful in, and maybe you can translate these ideas directly back to your practice. So then there's the reactive. And this is when the media comes to you looking for a story. If you recall how I mentioned that you want to be, a lot of the reporters, they'll have 1 or 2 or 3 or 4 kind of experts in the community that they'll come to. So let's say that the reporter, we've had this happen recently where a reporter wanted to cover allergy season, and we had built a great relationship with the local television guy. And he came to our group looking for an ENT that could go on camera talking about allergies. And then you've got the other side of reactive that none of us want to deal with, but that's when there's a crisis looming or something bad happens, and the media comes to you and just catches you off guard, and they want a story, and that's when we suggest that you would get a professional involved. And at the very least, when it comes to crisis management, it's important to have a plan in place.
All right, so let's go through a couple of quick examples here. What you're looking at is a screenshot from a health segment that was on public television. And what happened was we targeted this station and put out there that we had a couple of experts that could talk about some new trends in technology in the ENT specialty. It was actually hearing devices.
And what was nice about this, and you can do this right now in your respective markets, is this was your local government channel, like a PBS station, and maybe the viewership wasn't as high as your regular networks. But the beauty of this is that you get typically an older audience on this because it's the free stations, and they have great potential because they put all of these stories also on their website, and they have a great shelf life. And so especially on public television, if you can get a story or find a segment that you fit with, you might get it and it might air on a Tuesday, but then it might air on the next Thursday, and then it might air 3 months down the road, because this is always evergreen content for the most part, because they are creating things that aren't necessarily breaking stories, but they're ongoing educational and informational segments that they put out there into the community, and it's usually part of their funding process. And so we would encourage you to look at your local government stations and see what is available to you.
Yeah, I actually asked our contact there when this was going to air, and so he told me the date, and then he said, and then pretty much indefinitely after that, it would just be replayed whenever they had open blocks and things like that. So, yeah, definitely worth the time and effort to put together a nice pitch letter and say, hey, this is what we do, this is what we offer. And what came out of this was a 30-minute segment that just focused on the practice. And we had a couple of docs go out there, and we actually had a patient join as well. So we got the patient side, and it was a really great piece, and it was well put together and well produced, and we didn't have to spend a dollar for it.
Not a dollar. So here is one of our doctors that we have worked with, and this is with the local Fox affiliate. And essentially, the way that we were able to secure this piece is by beefing up a relationship that this practice has, and just being real proactive in the relationship with the local hospital, the hospital partner that they've got privileges at. And that's because this is a practice of only about 12 doctors, but they work with a very large hospital system in the Southeast, and that hospital system has entire departments of public relations professionals. And so what we do is a couple times a month, we'll sit down with the PR and the media team, and we'll bounce ideas off and say, here's what's new going on in the practice, new procedures that we're paying attention to. Here's some patient testimonials that might make good stories. And then those media folks are working with the local reporters on a regular basis, and they'll go out there and pitch it on behalf of the practice. So if there's one takeaway here, it's if you have relationships with a local hospital, make sure that you take full advantage of their media teams. You're not asking them to do all the work for you, but you're creating a relationship that works for you, and it works for them, and it works for the local press too.
Yeah, and if you don't have a relationship, or at least a strong relationship, let's say with a hospital, then we suggest creating a strong tie with a health reporter on the station. This is for a different client, and it had nothing to do with the hospital, but we had a good relationship with the health reporter, and so when something like this arises, he knew to call our client first.
And to piggyback on that, how we had talked earlier about, identifying trends as they're happening and just kind of being proactive in looking for those potential stories. This is actually in the state of Florida with an orthopedic group that we work with, where we had one of the doctors featured in this segment. But we had gone out and done some legwork early on when Florida changed the concussion laws. And then, the NFL, for those of you who follow, NFL started changing the way that they were dealing with concussions. And then we started talking about concussions in youth sports. And because we had done some of that early legwork with the reporters during the changes in the laws, it just made it all the easier for us to become the expert of record.
Yeah, and this falls under what we were talking about earlier with television. They're looking for that health scare. And so, with all of the news going on about concussions and the NFL and things like that, they wanted to put a story together. They needed an expert, and we happened to have one, so we made sure that he was available.
So here's another example of a hand doctor that we do some work with, and there was some sort of report that had come out that talked about the dangers of texting. And I believe in the local market, an accident had occurred related to a driver and texting. And they were running stories on that. And we had a relationship with the local Fox affiliate, and we pitched them a story on the dangers of texting and what it actually does to your hand and wrist. And there's actually some studies that have come out that shows that too much strain on repetitive motion on your fingers and your ligaments actually have adverse side effects related to texting. And so we were able to get this doctor on the local station. He actually went to the studio and shot this. And this is actually from a couple years ago, and it still gets played today.
Yeah, if I'm not mistaken, he actually, this particular physician actually had a patient schedule an appointment just, I want to say it was within the past month or so. They saw this and they thought, hey, that guy knows what he's talking about. And he picked up the phone and called. And so, even though this is from a few years ago, it's still, it's what we call evergreen. All right, now let's talk a little bit about the other side of the coin, which is reactive PR. So you can see some headlines there. That is what you don't want. That's when the media comes to you and there's a story and you have to be prepared. It's also called crisis management often. And reactive can go either way. There could be something that pops up. Maybe you haven't heard about it yet, but some of those proactive contacts that you have, they'll call and say, hey, we need somebody for this. And then that it pays off that way. And like I said, the other side of the coin is when something negative happens and then you're getting bombarded with phone calls and emails and things like that. And you have to be prepared, and you have to have your physicians prepared to respond to these things.
And let's hope that none of us ever have to deal with this. But there is something to be said about having a game plan in place if you ever have to deal with a crisis, because 10 out of 10 times if you are on the receiving end of any of these types of stories, the media is going to show up at your office, and they're going to have the cameras on when they go right through the doors, and it's going to be one of those segments where you got a hand in the camera and a no comment, and somebody was caught off guard. So it's good that that your front desk staff or whomever that is dealing with the media, when they walk in, knows who it is within the office that they need to call, and probably the practice administrator, or if you're large enough to have a PR team, or if you have somebody on retainer, there has to be some sort of game plan in place. And it'd be good once in a while to review that game plan so that you can be prepared if you ever have a crisis you have to deal with.
But none of us are ever going to have to deal with that, right? Fingers are crossed and all that, so we'll be okay.
All right, so let's move on. We've talked about reactive and proactive public relations, and let's now go into just a basic understanding of the basics. All right, so we're going to talk in this section about what a press release is and when to use it, what a media alert is and when to use it. We're going to talk a little bit about B-roll, which is being used more and more. And we're going to talk about background and off the record. And we're going to talk about building your media list.
All right, so first let's talk about the press release. We're going to cover why would you choose a press release, when you should actually send one, and a little bit of the anatomy real quick. But don't worry about the anatomy part so much, because we're actually going to include that in the show notes. If you scroll down a little bit, you'll see that we've got a template with some comments on there that you can use for your practice. So really, a press release is used when you've got to send a lot of details. It's also used after the fact when you're trying to recap an event or send some photos or do some announcements. Typically, they are pretty short. They stay within one page, and you always want to include a quote from either a physician or the executive director of the practice, somebody that is worth quoting, because oftentimes that is one of the sections that gets picked up.
And more often than not necessarily with a daily newspaper, but with a trade publication or a community-based paper, if there's room, a lot of times they will pick up your entire press release. So when you're drafting your press release, and Corey will put this in the show notes, but when you're drafting your press release, write it like the entire thing is going to get picked up, because it literally could show up in print. You won't even know it. But when you have a good media list and you send it out, that's what you're hoping is actually going to happen.
Yeah, it's almost like a mini news story that they pick up. They don't have to do any work, and if they have space to fill, they'll go ahead and pop it in. Or if they are interested, you might get a phone call and they say, hey, we saw this press release and wanted to schedule an interview to go over it a little bit more, something like that. All right, so next up, let's talk about a media alert. And again, we're going to have a sample alert in the show notes with the comments and all that good stuff. So with a media alert, really, you're sending that out prior to an event. So one good example of a photo op that you could have for a media alert, say you've got a ribbon cutting coming up, you're opening a new office, you're going to be at an event or something like that. And this is very basic: who, what, where, when, and why. And basically what you're saying is, hey, this is happening and you guys might want to come out because of X reason.
when you're thinking about your media alert, this is typically centered around an event or a photo op in particular. Consider when you're setting your times. It's not always about convenience for you or for your doctors or for the business community. It's a lot of times set your times where it's convenient for the press, especially if you're trying to get television out there. Remember, they've got a 12 o'clock segment that will run at lunch. They have a 5 o'clock segment, they have a 6 o'clock segment, and they typically have a 10 or an 11 p.m. segment. So if you want them to do something that's going to be picked up at lunchtime, you may want to run your event around 10:30 in the morning. And you should start thinking about how far in advance you'll need to tell the media so that they can plan in it when they're doing their production meetings early in the morning.
And real quick on that same note, you should also consider that when you're picking the where, especially with television, if there's any way that you can have a photo op somewhere where it's convenient for them to get to, that will go a long way in actually having the van come out there.
And I'll end on this too. If you have interviews that people are available for, go ahead and have that prearranged and include that in your alert. So if you have a doctor that is going to be available to talk about a particular procedure, or maybe you're making a donation to a local nonprofit as part of your ribbon cutting, and you have the spokesperson from that nonprofit there, you want to include all of this in your media alert because again, you want to hand it to them on a silver platter. You want to have the location set up, have the time be just right, have get the story set up for them, and make sure there's a quiet place where they can get the interview and have the people ready that are going to have the interview. This is how you get into the news cycle. All right, so let's talk about B-roll. Corey, why don't you go ahead and tell us what B-roll is?
So B-roll is basically any sort of supplemental or alternative footage that you can intercut with the main shot of an interview. And what we find is that if you can provide this B-roll, sometimes the media can't make it out to your event, but if you can send some of this footage in, they can actually intercut it with a story or an interview or a phone call with a doctor or something like that, and package it up and put it on the news. And all you had to do was, pull out your little handheld camera and upload it and send it to them. It goes back to that silver platter idea that Jen was just talking about.
Yeah, we have a couple of examples where we've used B-roll and it's actually worked to our advantage. One is we had a practice that was doing a check presentation from kind of a fundraiser that they had held within their offices. And it wasn't something that was sexy enough for the media to come out that day, but we knew that during the check presentation, if we got it on camera, we had a likelihood that it would get picked up. And that's what we did. We took our little handy dandy high def office camera that we use for video, and we shot the check presentation and sent it to the media. And lo and behold, it showed up on the television channel.
And I just want to point out real quick very similar example, but one that was actually a little bit easier. We actually we did a sport ball donation presentation, and we had a couple of officials from a school board come out, and we took a photo. We submitted just the photo, and that actually got put up online too.
Yeah, Corey, remember the time that we had we had doctors that were providing the high school physicals as a charity event for one of the local schools. And Corey went out there with his video camera and shot some video because it was a school that was kind of, out in the outskirts of town, shot that video footage. And we got play several nights in a row just promoting the idea that you needed these high school physicals before you could play a school sport. And our doctors got play after play after play. And that was just because we had the foresight to go out and shoot some video and then send it to our reporters.
Yeah, definitely. And we're actually still getting play on that video today. And we'll talk about that in a minute about some of the things you need to remember once you actually do get some of this footage. So, but before we get to that, I want to talk real quick about background and off the record. It sounds kind of cliche, and you hear it sometimes in movies or on TV where you say, "Is this off the record?" And you have to. That's real. That's a thing. And if you don't say that, then anything that you say can actually be used. So typically, the only time that you have to use this or inform your doctors to use this is if you're trying to give a little bit of perspective on a situation. For instance, recently we had a story done with ACL tears in female athletes, and the news crew came out and they were filming this. It was a local. It was a local sports club. And what we had to do was say, off the record, we just want to make sure that you guys know that this isn't something that this club is experiencing. This is actually a phenomenon that's kind of found within females as a whole. And you just want to make sure that they understand the full story and they report it correctly.
Yeah, you hope they report it correctly. I mean, this is sometimes it's a crapshoot, but the better the background you can provide, and you can educate the reporter, the better the likelihood that you're going to get a good story. And we take off the record very seriously, because if you don't say it, like Corey said, anything that you say can end up on the record. So let's talk real quickly about developing your media list. And this is pretty simple. It's about building relationships and then using those relationships that are mutually beneficial for both parties involved. But when it comes to the media, first you want to understand how it is that they want to be contacted. Do they want a phone call? Does the reporter want an email? Does the reporter prefer to go back and forth in a private message via Facebook? I had a television reporter last night, actually, that was messaging me on Facebook, and then I ended up in the morning news cycle on TV this morning, actually. And then so you want to give them, you want to reach out to them in the way that they want to be reached out to. You also want to know the type of stories a reporter actually wants to receive. Before you pitch a print story, let's use as an example, make sure you've read some of their backstories so that you understand the types of stories that they run, typically the types of interviews that they're looking for, and what types of things actually get printed. I think that's important to have a little bit of history on the journalist before you start pitching them a story.
Yeah, definitely. And the same goes for any type of blogger or online outreach. You want to make sure, and even with the print stuff, that you look at the website, you kind of see what it's about. Maybe even when you're talking to them, reference a story that they've written recently that you read and you liked. And, it's a fine line between sucking up and showing that you actually know what they do. But it does go farther than just sending out a massive blast that you've BCC'd people on. And, those are pretty often, they're not even open or they're ignored right away.
Yeah, the BCC emails are a dime a dozen. And then finally, we talked about this a little bit before, but be where the reporters are. If they're on Twitter, then get on Twitter and follow them. If they are on Facebook, get on Facebook and follow them. If they're going back and forth on a media related blog, then do that. Or if they're having coffee every Tuesday morning at the local Starbucks, figure it out and go in there and meet them and build those relationships. And then I will add this to it. We don't have a bullet on this, but once you develop a strong media list, covet that list. These are your relationships and you've built them along the way, and they're all based in trust. And don't be quick to hand out your media list to anybody else. You are the contact and you need to build those relationships. So let's talk real briefly about what to do when the media calls you, because it probably will happen. So these are two questions that I am a stickler for to ask when a reporter calls. The first is ask what the story is about. Chances are they're going to tell you, but ask what the story is about and try to figure out which angle they're taking. And then here's the most important one to me. When is your deadline? There is nothing worse that happens to me usually a couple times a week, where a reporter will call and my assistant will answer the phone and say, hey, the reporter called, and I'll say, when is their deadline? And then my assistant will say, I forgot to ask. This is important because once you figure out what the story is about, you need to know when the deadline is so that you know that how long you've got to gather your thoughts, put together your talking points, and try to figure out which angle they're going to come at so that you can be as positive as possible and get the best outcome possible.
All right. So this reporter calls and they've requested an on-camera interview from a doc that you've got. So then what? Well, the first thing is to decide if your doctor is okay on their own or if you need a point person. And we all know what those doctors are like. Some of them, they've got their head screwed on straight and they are down to earth, and you can say, hey, you need to be here at this time, and they'll go do it and they'll handle their business. And sometimes some of them need a little bit more hand holding. So, and that's putting it nicely. So you need to decide if they can go out and do that on their own, or if you have to meet first at the office and drive to a location together and prep them and inform them. So just something to consider there. And then, if you want the story when you're driving to that location, you want to make sure that it's convenient. I mentioned this earlier. The more convenient it is for the news party, then the more likely it is that it's going to happen. So when you're trying to choose a location, think outside the box a little bit, think outside the office walls a little bit, and you'll get not only a better, more interesting backdrop, but it's also more likely that the reporter is going to say, okay, yeah, let's do it. And after the story airs, do not forget to ask for that link or that footage or what have you. Um, Oftentimes they'll put that on their website, and depending on the station, they'll host it themselves, which is great until 3 months later when they don't and it's still sitting on your website, or you want to reference it for something and it's no longer there. So it's best if you can get that footage and you've got a YouTube channel or something like that where you can put it up, embed it on your website as a blog post, and just have it up there for patients to view for years and years to come. You put in all this hard work, so you want to make sure that it's up there and patients can look at it when they're ready to schedule that appointment.
All right, so just let's talk about media training for your physicians. And really, this is media training for all of us, but media training for your physicians in particular, because they're probably going to be the ones that are on camera. So before you go on camera or you speak with the reporter over the phone, there's some basic tips that we'd like you to follow. First is talk through the scenario. And what I mean by this is it'll help you stay on message, but we have an example recently of an ophthalmologist that we work with who had done an eye surgery on a professional golfer. And when the reporter called, they wanted to get kind of the doctor's perspective on the surgery. And when we sat down with the physician, we had a kind of an in-depth discussion in the course of a couple of minutes, of course, about which way that this story could go. And it could have gone in that, local golfer got the surgery and he's going to be better for the as a result of it. Or it could go with, professional golfer injured, may not recover, could ruin career. And so we went through these two different scenarios with the physician before he went on camera to talk about this. And he also called the golfer and cleared it with him as well. But it's just the point that we're trying to make is that just because they call and you feel like they're going to run a nice fluffy story doesn't mean that it's going to be so. And so you should think through every possible scenario that could go through. Take the time, because of course, when somebody answered the phone and talked to the reporter, they found out when their deadline was. So do some research so you can get some quick facts and maybe some quick statistics. Practice with somebody, quick question and answer. And worst case scenario, if you are helping the doctor prepare to go on camera, maybe write up a couple of questions that he can give some consideration, or she can give some consideration when they're en route to going to meet up with the reporter.
And sometimes, if you're lucky, if you ask the reporter to send over questions beforehand, they actually will do that. So you know what angle the story is going to be, and you can actually put them in front of the doctor and say, they're going to ask you these 4 things. Study.
And then I would say stick to sound bites. This is especially if you've talked through the scenario and you've done some quick research and you kind of know which way you want the story to go, and you're practicing a couple of questions and answers with the physician, then it should be pretty simple for the physician to provide quick, concise answers that will show up in a soundbite. You probably got 3 to 7 seconds in a soundbite. And so that's how fast the answer should be to the questions.
And real quick, I want to tie this bullet into the stay on message one. I have an example that just popped into my head where we had a physician do a story and he went off on a tangent that had roughly nothing to do with what we were originally supposed to be talking about. That's the piece that got edited down and put into the story. So you want to make sure that you stick to sound bites and the sound bites are relevant and on message.
Good point, Corey. Good point. So the final point to take away before you go on camera or you speak with a reporter over the phone is to think before you speak. That's how you get good stories and positive PR for your practice.
All right. And with that said, let's move on to a quick recap of what we went over today. And you want to make sure that you choose the right PR channel for your practice and for your story and what you're trying to get out there. You need to be ready for proactive and reactive public relations, because odds are if you do this long enough, one way or the other, you're going to have to deal with them. Understand the basic PR mediums, and that's which channel you're going to use and why you're going to use that one and what the differences are. And you also want to be prepared for when the media calls you. Make sure your physicians are prepared as well. And going with that, you want to practice media training with your docs and make sure they know what to say when they're out there.
So next up in our marketing series is we're going to talk to you about telling your story. Sometimes it's hard from a public relations standpoint to get the media to pick up your story. So we're going to talk to you about creating patient brand advocates. We're going to share with you some tips for using testimonials to get your story across from your practice. And we're going to go in depth and answer some questions that we get on a regular basis with our clients about telling their story and how we use social media and all the new channels that are available to us to do so. And so with that, I want to say thank you so much for joining Dr. Marketing Tips. We hope that you found today's session helpful and that you will check the show notes and use that sample press release and media alert that Corey put in there to your advantage when you are out there being proactive in your public relations. And with that, we want to say thank you for joining us, and we'll see you next week.
Talk to you then. Thanks, guys.